This story contains themes of crime, corruption, and loss, intended for mature audiences. The garage smelled like 30 years of things I never threw away. Oil rags, old paint cans, a lawnmower I hadn't touched since Margaret passed. Cardboard boxes stacked 3 high along the back wall, some of them sealed with tape that had gone yellow and brittle, the kind that peels off in strips and doesn't stick to anything anymore. A set of snow tires I'd been meaning to sell since 2011. A wooden workbench along the left wall, with tools hanging above it on pegboard hooks, most of them exactly where I'd put them 20 years ago. Dust on everything. The particular stillness of a space that had been waiting too long for someone to pay attention to it. I'd been meaning to clean this place out for years. I just never had a reason that felt real enough. Danny gave me one. He called on a Tuesday morning, same as he'd called the Tuesday before that, and the one before that. His voice had that particular tone he used when he was trying to sound patient. The one that told me he'd already decided what the right answer was, and was simply waiting for me to arrive at it on my own. He said the realtor needed the garage cleared before they could do a proper walkthrough. He said the market was good right now, better than it had been in 3 years. He said a smaller place would be easier to manage, something closer to him and Carol. Maybe a 1-floor unit in that new development over in Oak Park, where a lot of people his age's parents were moving these days. People his age's parents. I'd turned that phrase over in my head for a day and a half. I said I'd get to it, which was true. I just didn't say when, or why, or what I actually intended to do about the rest of his proposal. What I didn't say was that I had no intention of selling. Not because I was being stubborn. Well, maybe a little, if I'm being honest. Which at 72, I've decided is the only way worth being. But because this house was the last place that still felt like something. Margaret picked out the kitchen tiles. She planted the rose bushes along the front walk. The ones that came back every spring, whether I remembered to tend them or not. As if they were honoring a commitment she'd made that outlasted her. She painted the bedroom that particular shade of blue that Danny always said looked like a hospital room, and she always said looked like the sky over Lake Michigan on a clear morning. I wasn't ready to hand all of that to a stranger, with a checkbook and a renovation plan, who would paint over her blue walls and dig up her rose bushes and call it updating the property. But the garage I could do. I started on a Wednesday, after my second cup of coffee. Dressed in old work clothes, canvas pants worn soft at the knees, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, work boots I'd had resoled twice. And I pulled the side door open and stood there for a moment, just looking. The October light came in flat and gray, the way it does in Chicago when the season has made up its mind but the temperature hasn't quite caught up yet. Cold enough for a jacket, warm enough to feel foolish wearing one. I stood in the doorway and breathed in the smell of oil and old cardboard and dust. And something about it felt like standing at the entrance to a place I'd been avoiding without knowing I was avoiding it. I worked slowly. That's the only way I work now. Not because I can't move faster. I can when I need to. But because there's no reason to hurry through a thing when you have nowhere else to be. I went through boxes one at a time, the way I used to go through evidence methodically, without assumption, letting each item tell me what it was before I decided what to do with it. Old case files I'd brought home and never returned. The kind of thing you couldn't do today with all the digital records and chain of custody protocols. But back then, nobody tracked that too carefully if you were a detective with 30 years on the job and a reputation for closing cases. A box of Margaret's gardening books she'd asked me to donate 6 years before she died, and that I never got around to. I set those aside separately. still not quite ready to let them go. A canvas bag with a broken zipper full of extension cords. A box of Christmas ornaments we'd bought the first year we were married, 1979, at a little shop on Clark Street that had been gone for decades. And then a tackle box, canvas and aluminum, latched with a clasp that had gone stiff with rust. I recognized it immediately. It was from a fishing trip to Wisconsin in 1987. A long weekend in September that Elias and I had taken when we were both young enough to think we'd do that kind of thing regularly. We hadn't caught much. We'd drunk a good deal of bad beer and talked for hours about everything and nothing. The way you can only talk with someone who already knows the important things about you and doesn't need them explained. I set the tackle box aside and didn't open it. Elias Raymond Drummond, my partner for 11 years, from 1985 to 1996. The best detective I ever worked beside, and the best friend I ever had, which in my experience are two things that rarely go together, but when they do, you understand what the word irreplaceable actually means. He died on a November night in 1996 on the Eisenhower Expressway single-vehicle accident. Excessive speed, poor visibility, the kind of report that gets filed and closed and forgotten. Because accidents happen and the city doesn't stop moving. I never entirely believed it. Not because I had evidence, not because I knew something specific, just because I knew Elias, and Elias was not a man who lost control of his vehicle in a way that killed him and nobody else at 9:30 on a clear enough Tuesday evening. But knowing a thing in your gut and being able to prove it are two entirely different matters. And after a while, you learn that the gap between them is where grief lives when it has nowhere else to go. By noon, I had cleared half the floor space and filled 4 garbage bags. I was working my way along the back wall, moving the lawnmower, angling out the old wooden shelving unit that had been bolted loosely to the wall studs, when I felt the resistance. The shelf moved about 8 inches and stopped. Not because of weight, because something behind it was wedged in the gap between the shelf and the baseboard. I pulled harder, angled the unit out another 6 inches, and leaned down to look. There was a gap there maybe 4 inches wide, running along the base of the wall behind where the shelf had stood. Dark, full of old cobwebs. The kind of space that exists in old houses and garages without anyone ever thinking about it. And in that gap, pushed back against the baseboard with deliberate care, was a metal box. I crouched down. My knees reminded me that I was 72 years old in a way that was difficult to ignore. I ignored them anyway. Reached in and pulled it out. Roughly the size of a shoebox, maybe a little deeper. Dark gray metal, with rust along the seams, and a combination lock on the front hasp that had gone stiff with age and disuse. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it heavier than the size suggested, which meant it wasn't empty, and looked at the bottom, where someone had scratched 3 letters into the metal with something sharp and deliberate, like a man marking something he needed to be found by the right person. E-R-D. I sat down on the garage floor. Just sat down, right there on the cold concrete, with the metal box in my lap and the October wind pushing through the gap under the garage door and moving the dust around my feet. I sat there for what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been longer, and I didn't think about anything specific. I just held the box and let the fact of it settle into me the way cold water settles slowly, completely, reaching places you didn't know were waiting to be reached. Then I thought about the combination. Elias and I had a thing, going back to our first year as partners. We used badge numbers for everything that needed a code locker combinations, file cabinet locks, The small combination padlocks we put on our desk drawers at the precinct when the department started filling up with people we didn't entirely trust. It was a habit born out of practicality and the particular kind of shorthand that develops between two people who spend more waking hours together than they spend with their own families. His badge number was 4179. I turned the dials with my thumb. 4, 1, 7, 9. The lock opened with a sound that seemed very loud in the silence of the garage. I lifted the lid. Inside the box, the first thing I saw was the gun, a Colt 45, blued steel, wrapped loosely in an old cloth that had once been a dish towel. In better condition than it had any right to be after 3 decades in a garage that got cold in winter and damp in spring. Elias had always been meticulous with his weapons, more so than most of the men at the precinct, who treated their service pieces as tools and nothing more. To Elias, how you maintained your firearm said something about how you maintained everything else that mattered. He cleaned his every week, whether he'd fired it or not. Even now, even after all this time, the metal held a faint, dull sheen, like the memory of care. I set the gun aside and looked at what was underneath. A photograph, 8 by 10, printed on the thick, glossy paper they used in the 90s. The colors faded to that particular warmth that old photographs take on, slightly amber at the edges, slightly soft at the center, like a memory that has been handled too many times. 6 men in police uniforms standing in front of the 18th District building on Michigan Avenue. The department picnic, summer of 1995. I remembered the day because it was the last time the whole unit was together before things started going wrong in ways none of us fully understood yet. I was there, third from the left, younger, heavier through the shoulders, with hair that was still mostly dark. Margaret always said I looked like I was tolerating the photograph rather than enjoying it, which was accurate. Elias was standing beside me, his arm not quite around my shoulder in the way of men who are comfortable with each other, but still aware of the camera. He was grinning the way he grinned when he was genuinely happy. There was a difference between that grin and his polite one, a looseness around the eyes that you couldn't fake, and I'd always known which one was which. At the far right of the photograph stood Thomas Hargrove, not a senator then, a lieutenant, recently promoted, with the kind of careful smile you see on men who are already thinking about their next position before they've fully occupied the current one. Even in the photograph, you could see the slight separation. He was standing close enough to the group to belong, but angled just enough away from it to suggest that belonging wasn't really the point. Someone had drawn a red X across his face. The ink had bled slightly into the paper over the years, darkening at the edges, feathering into the grain of the photograph in a way that made it look almost like a wound. But the intention was unmistakable. Beneath the photograph was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully, the crease splitting slightly where it had been folded for 30 years. The handwriting was Elias's. I'd have known it anywhere. That particular blend of careful print letters and hurried cursive that he used when his thoughts were moving faster than his hand could follow. It said, "If you're reading this, they found me. Don't be a hero. Run." That was all. No date, no explanation. No instruction beyond those 2 sentences and the word run, which sat at the end of the second sentence like a door being pulled shut. I read it 3 times. Then I reached back into the box and found the last item, a wristwatch. Elias's watch, a Seiko with a steel band that he'd bought secondhand in 1983 and worn every day for as long as I'd known him. Through crime scenes and court appearances and 11 years of partnership. The crystal was shattered, spiderwebbed from a single point of impact, the hands frozen beneath the broken glass. I turned the face toward the light and read the time it had stopped at. 11:14. 11:14 at night. I set the watch down on the concrete floor very carefully, as if it were still fragile after 30 years. And I sat with the number. The official report on the death of Elias Raymond Drummond stated the time of death as 9:30 in the evening. Vehicle accident on the Eisenhower Expressway. Excessive speed. Poor visibility. No other vehicles involved. Accidental death. Case closed within 72 hours, which was itself faster than these things usually moved, though I hadn't thought much about that at the time. Because grief has a way of narrowing your attention to the immediate and the personal. 11:14, 9:30, 1 hour and 44 minutes. A man's watch does not stop an hour and 44 minutes after he is already dead. Not unless something is wrong with one of the numbers. Not unless someone, somewhere, with access and motive and the right connections, had reached into an official document and changed what it said. I sat in that garage for a long time after that. When I finally went inside, I didn't call Danny. I thought about it. I sat at the kitchen table with the contents of the box laid out before me. The gun, the photograph, the letter, the watch. And I thought about picking up the phone and telling my son what I'd found. I could hear his voice before I dialed. That careful, measured tone he used for difficult situations. The tone of a man who had learned to manage his father the same way he managed difficult clients. I thought about the words he would use. Concerning. Understandable. And then, gently, but with complete certainty. Dad, you've been alone a lot lately. Sometimes we see patterns that aren't really there. So I didn't call. I made a sandwich I didn't eat and poured a glass of bourbon I did drink. And I sat with the evidence of a dead man's final warning and tried to think like a detective, which is the only way I've ever known how to think when something matters. The watch was the key. Everything else could be argued by a creative lawyer. The letter was the paranoid preparation of a man with real or imagined enemies. The photograph with the red X was the action of someone under stress. The gun was legally owned and meant nothing by itself. But the watch was a physical object with a specific number on its face. And that number contradicted a legal document. And legal documents don't contradict physical evidence by accident. They do it when someone with access makes them. Who had access to a medical examiner's report in 1996? A lieutenant on his way up. A man who needed a thread cut before it unraveled, something that would end his career and his freedom, both. A man who was now a state senator, 3 months away from winning a third term, whose face appeared on billboards along the expressway and whose name appeared on the sides of buses, and whose carefully cultivated reputation for public integrity had been built, brick by brick, on top of a grave. I thought about Elias in those last months before he died. The way he'd gotten quiet in a way that wasn't like him. Elias processed the world out loud, he thought, by talking, worked through cases by narrating them. And his silence in those final weeks had been noticeable, in the way that a clock stopping is noticeable. Not because it makes a sound, but because something that was always there suddenly isn't. I'd asked him twice. He said he was tired. I believed him because it was the easier thing to believe. That was my failure. Not the only one. But the one that stayed with me through 29 years of retirement and quiet and bourbon in the evenings, and the persistent low-grade knowledge that something had been left unfinished. I was on my second glass when I got up to draw the kitchen curtains. An old habit, the kind you develop over decades of working cases where people knew where you lived. And that's when I saw it. A black SUV parked across the street, 2 houses down. Engine running. No lights. Nobody getting in or out. Just sitting there in the dark with that particular quality of stillness that isn't actually stillness. The stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, which is different from the stillness of something that simply isn't there. In my neighborhood, on a Wednesday night in October, that vehicle had no business being there. I stepped back from the window and kept to the shadow of the curtain. I stood there and watched for 11 minutes by the clock on the microwave. The vehicle didn't move. Nobody emerged. The engine kept running. A low vibration I could feel more than hear when I pressed close to the wall near the window frame. They already knew about the box. I didn't know how. Maybe the box's location had been tracked for years, someone watching to see if I ever found it. Maybe the act of opening it after 30 years had triggered something I couldn't understand from where I stood. It didn't matter how. What mattered was the fact I had opened a box this morning. And by 9 o'clock that night, there was a vehicle parked outside my house with its engine running. That was not a coincidence. I turned off every light in the house, starting with the kitchen, moving through the rooms the way I used to move through dark buildings on the job, slowly, without touching walls, listening to the house around me. I went to the bedroom closet and got the lockbox from the top shelf and took out my .38 revolver, cleaned and loaded, because old habits are old habits for a reason. That doesn't expire when you do. Then I went back to the garage, not for the box I'd already brought the contents inside. I went because I needed to look at the floor. I crouched down near the base of the wall where the shelf had stood and shone my flashlight along the concrete. And there it was, a smear of mud on the floor, narrow and partial, near the spot where the metal box had been hidden. Not old mud, not the dried gray dust of decades. This was darker, still slightly tacky at the edges when I touched it with one finger. Fresh mud. Within the last day or two, maybe less. Someone had been in my garage before me. Someone had moved that shelf, or tried to, had gotten close enough to leave a boot print in the mud they'd tracked in from outside, and then, for whatever reason, had not found what they were looking for, or had found it and put it back, or had decided to wait. I stood up and shone the flashlight around the rest of the garage. Nothing else disturbed. The boxes I'd moved were where I'd moved them, but the boot print was real. Someone had been here, in my garage, looking for the same thing I had found. The question was whether they'd come back tonight, or wait. I went inside, sat in the armchair in the corner of the living room, the chair that faced both the front window and the hallway, and I held the .38 in my lap and watched the dark street. I thought about Danny wanting to sell the house. I thought about Margaret's rose bushes and her sky blue walls and the 34 years of a life built in these rooms. I thought about how quiet the house had been for 8 years and how that quiet had always felt like something to endure rather than something to choose. And I thought about Elias, who had hidden a box in my garage because in all the world and all the people he knew, he trusted me most. Who had written 2 sentences on a piece of paper and waited for me to find them. Who had died on a Tuesday night in November on the Eisenhower Expressway at a time that didn't match his own watch. "Run," he said. I looked out at the dark street, at the empty curb where the SUV had been, at the flat October darkness of the neighborhood I'd lived in for 26 years. I wasn't going to run. Morning came the way mornings do in late October, without announcement. Just a gradual gray lightening of the windows, like someone slowly raising a shade in the next room. The SUV was gone. I'd fallen asleep in the armchair somewhere past 3, the .38 still in my lap, and woken at 6 with a stiff neck and the particular exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from spending a night braced against something that didn't arrive. My back registered its opinions. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood at the window looking at the empty curb. Gone didn't mean finished. It meant the night was over, and they'd be back when the time suited them better. It meant a report had been made to someone, and that someone was deciding what to do next. The chain of that went somewhere specific, and at the end of it was a name I already had. I drank the coffee and thought about where to start. You go back to the beginning. You find the people who were there. You ask the questions that sound casual until they don't. There was May Kowalski, records clerk at the 18th District for 22 years, now in a care facility up in Evanston. There was Ricky Voss, who was not anyone's first choice of conversation partner, but who had been running the margins of Chicago's West Side for 4 decades and had a way of knowing things that shouldn't have reached him. And there was the question of who had altered the medical examiner's report, which meant there was a medical examiner, or a former one, somewhere in this city who had done something under pressure 30 years ago and had been living with it ever since. I sealed the contents of the box in a manila envelope, taped it twice, and hid it behind the loose baseboard in the back of my bedroom closet. A space I'd made 20 years ago and never told anyone about, not even Margaret, which was the only secret I'd kept from her in 34 years, and one I was now glad existed. I looked at the photograph one last time before I sealed it away. Elias grinning. Thomas Hargrove with his careful smile and his slight angle away from the group. The red X, darkened now, like something that had been insisting on being seen for 30 years and had finally been given the chance. I put on my brown jacket with the lining Margaret had repaired twice. I put the .38 in the inside pocket. I locked the front door behind me and walked to the Ford. It was time to go find out if anyone else remembered. The Evanston Care Center smelled like floor wax and cafeteria food, and the particular kind of institutional warmth that tries very hard to feel like home and never quite gets there. I'd called ahead not to ask permission, but to find out visiting hours and whether May Kowalski still had days when she recognized people. The woman on the phone had been careful with her words. She said May had good days and difficult days. She said mornings were generally better. She said I was welcome to come, but shouldn't expect consistency. I drove up on a Thursday morning, taking the long way along the lake because the expressway reminded me of things I wasn't ready to think about yet. Lakeshore Drive in October has a particular quality. The water dark and restless to the east, the city rising to the west, the light doing that flat gray thing that Chicago does when it has decided summer is finished, and it means it. I'd driven this road 1,000 times over 40 years, and it still did something to me. Still made me feel like the city was a living thing with weight and memory, and a specific relationship to the people who'd lived inside it long enough to know its moods. I thought about what I was doing. A retired detective, 72 years old, driving north along the lake with a dead man's watch in his jacket pocket and a manila envelope of 30-year-old evidence hidden behind a baseboard in his bedroom closet. No badge, no jurisdiction, no institutional backing of any kind. Danny's words from the night before were still sitting in my head. Not because they were wrong, but because they were right in the way that correct and insufficient can sometimes be the same thing. He was right that I was a target. He was right that walking around asking questions without authority was dangerous. What he hadn't accounted for, what he couldn't account for, because he hadn't spent 30 years watching the machinery of law enforcement operate from the inside, was that authority wasn't always the thing that got things done. Sometimes, authority was exactly what had buried the thing you were trying to unbury. May Kowalski had worked the records desk at the 18th District for 22 years. She'd known every detective, every lieutenant, every piece of paper that moved through that building. And she'd known them with the particular intimacy of someone whose job is to remember what everyone else forgets. In a precinct full of men who treated records clerks as furniture, May had always struck me as the person who actually knew where everything was, not just the files. She knew where things were buried. She'd never said so directly, but there's a kind of silence that comes from knowledge, and May had it. And I'd recognized it the first week I worked at the 18th, and had respected it ever since. She was 83 now. The nurse who walked me down the corridor, a small woman named Patricia, who spoke about May with the gentle matter-of-factness of someone who had learned to be honest about hard things without being cruel about them, told me that May still knew her own name, still recognized faces from the old days sometimes, still hummed Polish hymns she'd learned as a child. She said the mornings were better. She said I should sit with her and not rush, that May responded better to patience than to questions. Her room was small and clean, with a window that faced a courtyard where a few trees were doing their October thing, half their leaves gone. The remaining ones the color of old copper pennies. May was sitting in a chair by the window when I came in, wearing a blue cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the courtyard with the expression of someone watching something they can't quite name. I pulled a chair over and sat down across from her without announcing myself. I'd learned a long time ago that with people whose memory comes and goes, you don't rush. You sit in the space they're occupying, and you wait for them to let you in. The same way you wait on a dark street corner, patient, quiet, watching for the door to open. After a long moment, she turned and looked at me. Her eyes were still sharp, dark brown, observant, carrying the particular quality of attention that some people hold on to their whole lives, regardless of what else time takes from them. She studied my face. Then she said, "Arthur Callahan, you got old." I said, "So did you, May." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then she looked back out the window. We sat like that for a while without talking, which felt right. I watched the courtyard. She watched the courtyard. One of the copper-colored leaves let go of its branch and turned slowly on the way down, and neither of us said anything about it. I asked her how she was feeling. She said her hip hurt, and the food was terrible, and she missed her cat, who had died 2 years ago. His name had been Gregory. I thought that was an excellent name for a cat, and I told her so. And she looked at me sideways with something that was almost a smile. Then the almost smile faded, and she was quiet again. Her hands moved slightly in her lap, a small, unconscious motion, like someone sorting through papers they could no longer see. I said her name gently. I told her I needed to ask her about something from a long time ago. Her eyes moved back to me, slower this time. The sharpness still there, but deeper now, like a light seen through dark water. She said Elias, just that, just his name, offered without prompting, as if she'd been holding it ready for 30 years, against the day when someone would finally come and ask for it. I said yes. I told her I'd found something of his. She looked at her hands. She was quiet for so long that I thought I'd lost her, that the window had closed the way Patricia had warned me it might, without warning or transition. But then she looked up, and she was still there, still present. Still May Kowalski, who had kept faith with a dead man's secret for 3 decades, because he'd asked her to. And she was not the kind of woman who let people down. She said he brought something. Before. A music box. He said, "Keep it and don't tell anyone." I said, "Elias, what is this?" And he said, "Just keep it. May." He said, "Someday, someone will come for it." Her voice had gone soft, the words running slightly together, the way they do when someone is pulling from very deep memory. Not reciting, but retrieving, which takes a different and more costly kind of effort. I asked her where the music box was now. She looked back at the courtyard. Then she said, "Bottom drawer, behind the photographs." The music box was a small, pale wood thing, 4 inches square, with a geometric inlay pattern on the lid. It played the opening bars of a waltz I half recognized, the mechanism sluggish with age, winding down slowly like something that had been patient for a very long time and was finally being asked to perform one last task. I held it in both hands and listened to it run out, and then turned it over. The bottom panel had been secured with 2 small screws. Their slots slightly stripped. Someone had tightened them with a coin or a knife blade in a hurry. In the specific hurry of a man who is finishing something quickly because he knows his time is short. I used the thin edge of May's letter opener and worked the screws free, carefully, the way you work any old fastening that has been tight for 30 years, with patience, with respect for what you're opening. The panel came away. Inside the hollow base, wrapped in a strip of electrical tape that had dried and cracked at the edges, was a small black film canister, 35 millimeter, still sealed. I held it up to the window light and turned it slowly. Whatever was inside had survived 30 years in a music box in a care home drawer. Whether it had survived in any useful form was a different question. I reassembled the music box carefully and put it back in May's bottom drawer, exactly as I'd found it. When I turned around, she was watching me from her chair. She said he was afraid. Not nervous afraid, like a man who has already made his peace and is just finishing up the last things. I sat down across from her again. I asked if she remembered anything else, any paperwork that had moved through the office strangely, any names that had come up in connection with Elias's case in the days after his death. She was quiet, reaching. Then she said a name, Garrett Pruitt. I wrote it on the back of a gas station receipt. She said medical examiner. Young one. He left after 3 months after. Didn't resign properly, just stopped coming in. I had to file the separation paperwork myself because nobody else would touch it. She paused, touched the arm of her chair with 2 fingers. A small, deliberate gesture. She said he looked bad when he came for his things. Like a man who has done something he can't undo and is trying to figure out how to carry it for the rest of his life. Garrett Pruitt, former medical examiner, departed abruptly in early 1997, 3 months after Elias. I put the name beside the other names I was accumulating and felt the shape of the thing becoming clearer. Not complete, not yet, but directional. The outline of a structure built by people who knew what they were doing and had done it carefully. I thanked May. I stood to leave. She reached out and touched my arm. Her grip was light but deliberate, the grip of someone who needs you to hear the next thing they say. She looked up at me and said, "Arthur, he didn't tell you because he was protecting you. You understand that?" I said I was beginning to. She nodded once. She let go of my arm and turned back to her courtyard and her copper-colored trees. And I left her there. This woman who had kept a dead man's secret in a music box for 30 years because he'd asked her to. And she was May Kowalski, and that was simply what she did. I stopped at a 1-hour photo lab on Diversey on the way across the city. The last one I knew of that still processed 35 millimeter film. Run by a man named Mr. Tan, who had been developing photographs since before digital made the whole enterprise nearly extinct, and who treated every roll that came through his door with the seriousness of someone who understood that photographs were evidence of things that had actually happened. He looked at the canister carefully. He said the film was old. He said he would do what he could, but there were no guarantees 3 decades of temperature changes and confined space could mean anything from perfect preservation to nothing at all. I said I understood. I told him I'd be back in 2 hours. I drove west to the flea market on Cicero Avenue. Ricky Voss was at his usual spot near the back of the lot, behind a folding table covered with old tools, used paperbacks, and a collection of ceramic figurines arranged without apparent logic. He was a heavy-set man with a face that had never been handsome but had developed over 60-odd years into something that was at least honest about what it was deeply lined, with small eyes that moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, calculating the distance to the nearest exit. He saw me coming from 20 feet away, and his whole body made a decision in real time. He stayed, which told me he'd been expecting something like this, or had been waiting for it, for longer than he would admit. I sat in the empty lawn chair across from his table without being invited. He picked up a ceramic shepherd from the table and examined it with great concentration. I told him about the box, the watch, the SUV on my street, the mud on my garage floor, fresh mud, I said, left by someone who had been in my garage looking for the same thing I found, and had either not found it or had deliberately left it for me. I watched his face when I said that last part. Something moved behind his eyes. I said, "Someone wanted me to find that box. Ricky. The question is whether that someone is on my side or on theirs." He set the shepherd down. He said, "Could be neither. Could be someone who wants the thing opened, but doesn't want to be the one who opens it." I let that sit. Then he told me about the land. 400 acres on the western edge of Cook County. Small farming families, most of them there since the 40s. A Delaware shell company with 3 layers of corporate structure between it and the man at the center. Thomas Hargrove, then a lieutenant with political ambitions and the right connections at City Hall, had been the architect. The families who didn't sell willingly found themselves buried under institutional pressure, permit problems, tax reassessments, violations on structures that had stood for 50 years without issue. The grinding machinery of bureaucratic harassment applied with patience and precision until cooperation became the easier path. Elias had started pulling on the thread after a property dispute complaint came through the precinct. He'd spent 8 months building a chain of ownership and documentation, working quietly and off the books because he'd understood early that the thread went somewhere inside the department. By the end, he had corporate records, photographs of meetings between Hargrove and the development group, and testimony from a farming family willing to speak. It was enough to open a federal investigation. It was not enough to make Hargrove feel safe. Ricky said Hargrove had used someone inside a sergeant in property crimes, named Vincent Caruso, to track how far Elias had gotten. When the answer came back, Hargrove had decided the arithmetic was simpler than a legal defense. Ricky said all of this quietly, the way you say something you've carried for 30 years and have gotten used to the weight of, but have never actually sat down before. I asked him about Garrett Pruitt. He looked at me sharply. He said, "How do you know that name?" I said, "May Kowalski." He absorbed that. He nodded slowly. He said, "Joliet. He runs a small animal clinic. He retrained as a veterinarian after he left the ME's office. I heard he drinks. I heard he doesn't sleep well. I've heard that about a lot of people connected to that year." He paused, turned the shepherd over in his hands. He said, "Callahan, what are you going to do with all this?" I said I was going to finish what Elias started. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Good. I've been waiting 30 years for somebody to say that." Mr. Ton met me at the counter with an expression that told me something before he spoke. He said the film had survived. Not perfectly, some frames were degraded, the edges soft and streaked with age and moisture. But the center frames, the ones best protected, had come through. He slid a paper sleeve of developed prints across the counter. I looked at them under the fluorescent light, one by one, slowly. Surveillance photographs, shot from distance through what looked like a partially open car window, with the slight blur of a zoom lens at its limit. 7 photographs total, 5 usable. They showed a meeting, 4 men seated at a table in a large empty space, a warehouse or industrial building of some kind. The walls bare concrete, a single overhead light casting hard shadows. 2 of the men I didn't recognize. One was a face I half knew from somewhere I couldn't immediately place. A heavyset man in his 40s, a city official of some kind. The bearing of a man accustomed to rooms where decisions were made. And one was Thomas Hargrove, younger than the photograph in the box, younger than the campaign billboards on the expressway, but unmistakable. The careful posture, the slight angle away from the table that somehow still communicated control of everything at it. He was looking at something being presented to him, a document or a map, spread across the table, his expression attentive and neutral, in the way of a man who has trained himself never to show on his face what he is actually thinking. I looked at each photograph carefully. The 4th one showed the same scene from a slightly different angle. Elias must have shifted position between shots, easing the camera toward a window in the background of the frame. And in the 5th photograph, the clearest of the usable ones, the window in the background showed something that stopped me cold. 2 figures outside the building, visible through the glass, standing close together in what appeared to be a separate conversation. Half in shadow, partially obscured by the window frame and the reflection of the interior light. A profile, not a full face, on the nearer figure. A man, middle height, the particular stance of a cop at rest, weight on one hip, Vincent Caruso. I was fairly certain of it, even in the degraded photograph, but it was the second figure that made me sit down on the stool Mr. Ton kept behind his counter without asking permission. Shorter, a woman, standing at an angle that showed the line of her jaw and the way she held her shoulders slightly forward. Attentive, the posture of someone who is both listening and deciding. I'd seen that posture every working day for 11 years. I'd seen it at crime scenes and in briefing rooms and across the precinct parking lot in all weather. Her name was Sandra Reeves. She had been the 3rd detective in our unit at the 18th from 1991 to 1997. She had stood beside me at Elias's graveside in November of '96, with her coat collar up against the cold, and wept in a way that had seemed entirely real. She had transferred to a federal liaison position in Washington in the spring of '97. I'd lost track of her after that. The way you lose track of colleagues when the shared context that connected you disappears. I hadn't thought about her in years. I thought about her now. I paid Mr. Ton and thanked him, and walked out to the Ford in the gray October afternoon. I sat in the car for a long time before I started it. The city moved around me, traffic on Diversey, a woman pushing a stroller, 2 men arguing cheerfully outside a restaurant in a language I didn't speak. The ordinary machinery of a Thursday afternoon in Chicago, indifferent to the particular weight I was carrying. Then I drove home. Danny was on my porch when I pulled in. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression he got when he was holding something in the jaw set, the eyes doing the work the rest of his face refused. He'd come from the office. This was not a casual visit. I unlocked the door and we went inside. I put the kettle on. Danny stood across the kitchen table and waited with the patience he'd inherited from his mother. He told me he'd received a phone call that morning. A man from the legal affairs office of Senator Thomas Hargrove. Polite, professional. He'd said there was concern that Arthur Callahan, retired, had been making inquiries of a sensitive nature regarding matters legally resolved many years prior. He'd mentioned the senator's significant legal resources. He'd expressed hope that the situation could be resolved without formal action. Danny repeated all of this, carefully and accurately, the way he handled testimony. Then he looked at me and said, "Dad, what is going on?" I told him enough. The box, the watch, the discrepancy in the medical examiner's report, the name at the end of the thread. I told him I believed Elias had been murdered and that the evidence had been deliberately altered by someone with the access and motive to do it, and that the person who had ordered it was currently running for his third term in the state Senate. Danny listened without interrupting, which cost him something. I could see in the way he held his cup without drinking from it. Then he said, "You can't do this." I said I'm already doing it. He said I was 72 years old with no badge and no jurisdiction and no protection. And that if these people were what I was saying they were, then my asking questions wasn't an investigation. It was a target painted on my back. He said I needed to take what I had to the FBI or the state's attorney and let people with actual authority handle it. I understood his argument. I respected it. And I knew that handing a manila envelope to the right authority was exactly what people with 30 years of practice at making things disappear were prepared for. The official channels weren't closed. They were managed. There was a difference. I said I'll think about it. He left an hour later, unhappy, still holding things in. I watched his car pull away and thought about the gap between us. The gap that had been growing since he was 12 years old and I was working a double homicide on Christmas Eve. And it had been growing steadily ever since. Through his law school and his career, and the careful, successful life he'd built on a logic I respected, but had never entirely been able to inhabit myself. I loved my son. That was the uncomplicated part. That was the part that didn't need examination. That night I drove west. Just driving. The way I used to drive when I needed to think. I was on Route 38, heading out toward the county line, when I picked up the headlights behind me. Two vehicles, staying back, maintaining distance with the practiced consistency of professional surveillance. Never closer than 3 cars. Never far enough to lose me. Changing lanes when I changed lanes, with the smooth coordination of people who had done this before. I drove for 6 minutes without changing my behavior. Steady speed, normal lane position, giving them no reason to close the distance. Then I turned south onto the county road that wound through the preserved wetland at the edge of the drainage basin the locals called the marsh. 2 lanes, no lighting, fog coming in off the water, thick and low. The kind of October fog that turns headlights into soft blurs and makes the road ahead look like it ends 20 feet in front of you, regardless of how fast you're going. I knew this road. I'd driven it in every condition over 30 years. Daytime, nighttime, fog, ice. The full range of what a Chicago area autumn and winter could produce. I knew where the road bent hard left 300 yards before the boat launch. A bend that came on you faster than you expected if you didn't know it was there. The outside edge of the curve dropping away into the soft drainage shoulder. I approached the bend at a moderate speed. In my mirror, I saw the first vehicle accelerate, closing the gap, reading my moderate speed as hesitation, as uncertainty, as a man who didn't know where he was going. I took the bend cleanly and pulled immediately right onto the gravel shoulder and killed my lights and engine. The first SUV came through the bend with too much speed and went wide. Not into the water, the road continued, but into the soft drainage ditch on the outside of the curve, where the gravel shoulder gave way to 4 inches of mud and then nothing solid. I heard it. The hard crunch of undercarriage meeting resistant earth, the high whine of tires spinning against ground that wouldn't give, the engine working against a situation it couldn't resolve. The second vehicle stopped at the bend. sat there in the fog with its lights on, the driver making a calculation. I started the Ford, drove back past the second vehicle, close enough to see the driver's face for a moment through the glass. Young, pale, not a face I recognized, and back onto Route 38. I drove home through the fog with the heater running and the photographs on the passenger seat and Elias's watch in my jacket pocket. And I thought about the young face in the second vehicle, and about Sandra Reeves standing in the background of a 30-year-old photograph, and about the mud on my garage floor, left by someone who had been looking for the same box I found. I thought about who had wanted me to find it. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the quiet car for a moment. Then I went inside and called Kyle. Kyle picked up on the second ring. He didn't say hello the way most people say hello as a greeting, as a social reflex. He said it the way he said most things, which was directly, as a simple acknowledgement that a channel had been opened and he was ready to use it. No preamble, no warm-up, just presence, immediate and complete. I said I need you to come over Saturday. Not the usual visit. I need to talk to you about something real. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone uncertain, the quiet of someone listening for the thing beneath the thing being said. Then he said, "I'll come tomorrow." That was Kyle. He heard the weight in a thing and responded to the weight, not the surface. I'd watched him do it his whole life without ever being able to explain how he did it. And I'd stopped trying to explain it and started simply being grateful for it. He arrived Friday evening, just after 6. While I was at the kitchen table with everything spread out in front of me, the photographs from Mr. Tan's lab laid out in sequence, the letter from the box, the medical examiner's report I'd pulled from the county records archive that afternoon, the official version, the altered version, the one that said 9:30 in the evening in type that had been produced on a machine by a hand that knew it was lying. My notes on a yellow legal pad, the handwriting smaller and more compressed than it used to be, the way handwriting gets when a man has more to record than he has patience for. 30 years of unfinished business arranged on a kitchen table in a house that was not going to be sold. Kyle came in through the back door the way he always did. He had a key, had had one since he was 15. A decision I'd made quietly and never explained, and which he had never once abused. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. He was tall like his father, but carried himself differently, with the particular stillness of someone who lives mostly inside their own head and has made genuine peace with the residency. He wore a gray sweatshirt and carried a backpack that he set down carefully by the door. The way he set everything down with deliberateness, as if the placement of objects in space was a thing worth doing correctly. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, "Since Wednesday." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without waiting to be asked, which was the right thing to do. I was glad he did it. I told him everything. Not the edited version I'd given Danny everything. The full account. In order. May and the music box and the film canister. The photo lab on Diversey and Mr. Tan's careful hands. Ricky Voss at the flea market on Cicero and the 40 minutes of bad coffee and 30-year-old truth. The photographs from the developed film, including the 5th one, the clearest one, with the 2 figures visible through the background window. The mud on the garage floor. Fresh mud, left by someone who had been in my garage before me and had either not found what they were looking for or had deliberately chosen to leave it. The SUV on my street the first night. The 2 vehicles on the county road in the fog, and the sound of undercarriage meeting soft earth. All of it, in the order it happened. The way I used to brief a case, chronological, factual, without interpretation, until the facts were fully on the table and could be seen for what they were. Kyle listened the way he always listened, completely. He didn't ask questions while I was talking. He didn't react visibly to the parts that were alarming, and some of them were genuinely alarming. He just listened, his eyes moving occasionally to the photographs between us, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator made its small sound. A car passed on the street outside, and its headlights moved across the ceiling and were gone. Kyle said, "The woman in the photograph, Sandra Reeves, do you know where she is now?" I said I didn't. Not yet. He opened his laptop, typed for about 90 seconds with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and exactly where to look. He turned the screen toward me. Sandra Reeves. Retired from federal service in 2019 after 22 years in a liaison capacity that had moved between several agencies without leaving much of a public trail. Currently in Scottsdale, Arizona. No criminal record. No significant public profile. The digital footprint of someone who had spent a long career learning to occupy space without being easily located within it. I looked at the screen. I thought about November of '96, and the gravesite in the cold, and the coat collar turned up, and the tears that had seemed entirely real. I thought about what it meant to work beside someone for 11 years and discover that a photograph taken 30 years ago contained a question you hadn't known to ask. Kyle said she might not have known the full picture. People in those situations often only know their own piece of it. I said, "She was in the photograph." He said she was outside the building, in the background. It could mean she was part of the arrangement. It could mean she was running her own surveillance on the same meeting, watching it the same way Elias was watching it. From outside, without being inside the room. It could mean she arrived after and didn't understand what she was looking at. One photograph taken through a car window at distance doesn't tell you which of those things is true. I looked at him across the table. 19 years old and applying the same standard of evidentiary caution I'd spent 30 years trying to hold on to under pressure. I hadn't taught it to him. He'd arrived at it on his own, through whatever interior process had produced the particular quality of mind he had. Careful, patient, resistant to the easy conclusion. I said, "You're right. I don't know yet what her presence in that photograph means." He nodded. He looked at the photographs again. The way he looked at problems, not searching for what he expected to find, but waiting for what was actually there to reveal itself. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" I told him I had a plan. I told him the plan had a piece I couldn't execute by myself. A technical piece. A piece that required a kind of capability I didn't possess, and that couldn't be improvised or faked. The plan was to draw Thomas Hargrove into a conversation. A direct conversation. Face to face. In a location that carried meaning. The kind of location that might cause a man to say things he would otherwise keep inside his careful, practiced silence. Not a trap in the conventional sense, more like an invitation extended to a man whose 3 decades of absolute security had produced in him the specific vulnerability of someone who no longer genuinely believed he could be touched. Hargrove had watched every loose end go quiet or disappear. He was 3 months from a 3rd term in the state Senate. The notion that a 72-year-old retired detective with no badge and no institutional backing could constitute a real threat. That notion would strike him as something to be managed. One more minor matter in a long career of managed minor matters. I was going to let him believe that until the precise moment it stopped being true. What I needed from Kyle was a way to transmit whatever happened in that final meeting to an audience large enough and public enough that it couldn't be buried after the fact. Not a recording to hand to a lawyer. Recordings got challenged, suppressed, tied up in proceedings for years, while the man who needed to answer for things continued standing at campaign podiums with his practiced smile. I needed something live, something that existed in the public record the instant it was created, already seen by enough people that recalling it was impossible before anyone could make the call to try. Kyle listened without expression. Then he said, "You want to live stream it?" I said yes. He said, "To where?" I said, "Somewhere it will be seen immediately by people who have a reason to pay attention." He thought. Not hesitating, there was a difference I knew well. Thinking, which has a quality of forward motion that hesitation doesn't. He said his campaign website has a public-facing social media integration. His team uses it for live events, town halls, policy announcements, that kind of thing. If I can access the stream credentials and route an incoming feed through them, anything broadcast will appear to originate from his own campaign account. His supporters will be the first audience. The press that monitors his campaign will be the second. By the time anyone on his side realizes what's happening, the feed will have been running long enough that the content already exists in too many places to pull back. I asked him if he could do that. He said, yes. Without qualification. Without the hedge that most people would attach to a statement like that. The, "just let me check," or "I think so," or "it depends." He said yes the way he said most things, as a factual statement about a capability he possessed and was prepared to apply. I said, "Kyle, I need you to understand what this means. Once it starts, there is no stopping it, and no taking it back. If anything goes wrong on your end, we lose the only real advantage we have. And if it works the way I'm planning it to work, it's going to move very fast." He looked at me steadily. He said, "I understand what it means." Then he said the thing I hadn't expected. He said he put your badge number on that lock. Not a random number, your specific number. The one that was yours. He hid that box from everyone else in the world, but he kept it for you. He knew where you lived. He knew where to put it so that if something happened to him, the right person would eventually find it. I said, "I know." He said, "So finish it." I looked at my grandson across the kitchen table and thought about the particular way that some things travel forward through time. Not in straight lines. Not through the people you expect, but sideways and diagonally. Through connections you couldn't have predicted. Arriving at the right place through routes that only make sense in retrospect. I said, "There's one more thing I need to do first." I drove to Joliet the next morning. The animal clinic was on a side street 3 blocks off the main commercial strip. A small brick building with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot that held 4 cars. One of them a dented pickup in the corner with leaves on its hood that hadn't been moved in several days. Inside, it smelled like antiseptic and warm animal, and the particular low-grade tension of a waiting room full of people who are worried about something they love. I asked for Dr. Pruitt at the front desk. The young receptionist looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to assess visitors before admitting them to the back. She said he was with a patient. I said I would wait. I waited 40 minutes. The room moved through its morning population, a beagle in a plastic cone, wearing the dignified resignation of an animal that has decided to accept its circumstances. A woman with a tabby in a carrier who spoke to it in a continuous murmur. A teenager with a cardboard box from which periodic sounds emerged, suggesting something small and opinionated about its situation. I read an old magazine and thought about what I was going to say. More importantly, I thought about what I was not going to say, and how I was going to say the things I needed to say without making him feel cornered. Because a cornered man tells you what he thinks will make you go away, rather than what is true. Garrett Pruitt came through the back door and stopped when he saw me. He was 61 or 62 now, heavy-set in the way of men who were lean at 29 and had accumulated the weight of years and sedentary worry so gradually that no single stage had seemed like much until you saw the sum of all of them. He wore scrubs and carried a clipboard, and had the face that May Kowalski had described, the face of a man carrying something he had never found a way to put down. He recognized me. I saw it in the fraction of a second before his professional manner reasserted itself. A stillness that moved through his body like a current, and then was gone. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "My name is Arthur Callahan. I worked the 18th District. I think you already know why I'm here." He took me out through the side door into the parking lot. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance. And I recognized the posture of a man who has been rehearsing a specific conversation for so long that having it in reality feels both inevitable and slightly outside the normal texture of experience. I told him what I had, the watch and the numbers that didn't match, the photographs, what Ricky Voss had told me about the structure of the land deal and the name at the center of it. I told him I was not there to destroy him. I told him I needed him to confirm what had happened to the original report, and I needed him to understand that a correction made 30 years late still counted as a correction. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at the parking lot for a long time. A car moved slowly past on the street. Inside the clinic, a dog voiced a complaint about something. Then he said, 2 days after, a man came to the office I had never seen before. He had a badge, but he covered the number with his thumb when he showed it. I noticed that. I noticed it at the time. I just didn't know what to do with it. He told me my report contained an error in the recorded time of death. He told me the correct time was 9:30 in the evening. He was very specific about the consequences for my report, and for me personally, if the error wasn't corrected promptly, and if I mentioned the correction to anyone. He stopped. His arms were still crossed, still holding himself together. He said I was 29 years old. My wife was 7 months pregnant with our first child. I told myself it was one number on one form. I told myself the man was already dead, and changing a number couldn't hurt him further. He looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has been conducting a long argument with himself and has gotten very tired of the sound of it. He said, "I've been telling myself that for 30 years. I have never once believed it." I asked him if he would make a formal statement. He said yes. I've been willing to for a long time. I just never had anyone to give it to who I trusted to actually do something with it. I gave him Diane Cho's name and number, federal prosecutor, Northern District. 15 years on the job. The particular stubbornness required to pursue cases that other people had decided were too complicated to be worth the effort. I told him to call her and use my name. He wrote it down on the back of a prescription pad with the focused attention of a man completing a task that has been on his list for longer than he can fully account for. We shook hands at the parking lot door. His grip was firm, firmer than I expected. The grip of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is surprised to discover what remains underneath it. I drove back to Chicago through the flat gray afternoon and thought about 29 years old and frightened, and the difference between the courage required not to do a thing in that moment, and the different and perhaps greater courage required to correct it 30 years later, when the damage had already been living inside you for so long it had become part of the architecture. I didn't judge Garrett Pruitt. Corrections made late still counted. They had to count. Otherwise, there was no point in any of it. That evening, Danny came, not because I'd called him. Kyle had called him. I found that out afterward. And when I did, I wasn't surprised, and I wasn't angry. Kyle had made a judgment, the way he made most decisions, quietly, based on his own assessment of what was needed. without asking permission for something he'd already determined was right. Danny arrived at 7. He came in through the front door, which was different from usual, and stood in the hallway looking at the kitchen table with its spread of papers and photographs. And then at me. And then at Kyle sitting at the counter with his laptop. He said, "Kyle called me." I said, "I know." He said you needed me here. I looked briefly at my grandson, who was looking at his screen with the studied neutrality of someone who has done something they're prepared to stand behind and is giving the principals room to work through it. I said, "Sit down, Danny." He sat. Kyle made coffee without being asked the thing his father had never once done in this kitchen, and set 3 cups on the table and returned to the counter at a distance that was present without being intrusive. I didn't talk about the plan. There would be time for Danny's anger about the plan, and his anger would be understandable and partially earned. What I talked about instead was Elias. I talked about 11 years of partnership in the specific, unglamorous, daily terms of what it actually was. More waking hours beside one person than beside anyone else in your life. A shared language of observation and shorthand and dark humor that required no explanation because you'd built it together across 1,000 working days. I talked about trusting someone with your life in the literal sense, which happened regularly, and also in the less literal but equally real sense of trusting them with who you actually were, when the professional surface came off at the end of a long day. I talked about the fishing trip in '87, the bad beer and the minimal fish, and the hours of conversation that ranged over everything and nothing. The way you can only talk with someone who already knows the important things about you and doesn't need them established. I talked about the last few months before November of '96, the quiet that had come over Elias like weather moving in, the humor going from easy to considered, the way he'd started watching the room before he entered it. I talked about asking him twice and accepting the answer he gave me, because it was easier than pressing, because I was tired and complacent, and because I told myself there would be more time. There wasn't more time. I talked about the phone call. Tuesday evening, November of '96. I was in the kitchen. The radio was on. Margaret was upstairs. The call lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and I know that because I looked at the clock when it started and looked again when it ended. And that number has never left me, the way some numbers never leave you, regardless of how many years you put between yourself and the moment that produced them. Danny listened the way his mother used to listen, completely, without the management he usually applied to difficult things. He drank his coffee, and he listened, and somewhere in the middle of it his expression changed. The careful, professional surface gave way to something simpler and less defended. The face of a son listening to his father name a grief that had been living in the house with them for 30 years without ever being properly introduced. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet. Danny said I didn't know any of that. About him. About what he meant to you. I said I know. I should have told you more. A long time ago. He looked at his cup. He said, I always thought the job was what you chose, over everything else. I never thought about what the job was actually taking from you at the same time. I sat with that. It wasn't the whole story, but it wasn't unfair either. And a man who can't acknowledge the parts of a thing that aren't flattering to himself by the time he's 72 hasn't been paying sufficient attention. I said, the job cost things. It also gave things back. Elias was one of the things it gave me. Losing him the way I lost him without the truth, without any accounting for what actually happened to him. That's been a cost I've been paying in installments for 30 years and never getting anywhere near the end of. Danny looked at me for a long moment. He said, what are you going to do? I said, finish it. He looked at Kyle at the counter. He looked back at me. He said, You two have already worked out how. Not a question. He was a lawyer, and lawyers read rooms the way detectives read crime scenes, by what's present, what's absent, and the shape of the space between them. I said yes. He went quiet. I watched something move through him, the part that wanted to object, working against the part that had just spent an hour listening to a story about a man he'd never known and a friendship he'd never been permitted to understand. I watched the outcome of that process settle across his face. He said, "Be careful, both of you. Please. Not don't do it. Not take it to the proper authorities. Just be careful," which, from Danny Callahan, was as close to "I trust your judgment" as I had heard from him in 20 years. And I received it as exactly what it was and nothing less. Kyle looked up from his laptop and met his father's eyes for a moment. Something passed between them, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who love the same difficult man and have just, separately and simultaneously, arrived at the same conclusion about what that love required of them right now. I picked up my coffee. Cold. I drank it anyway. Outside the kitchen window, the October night was fully dark. The rose bushes along the front walk had gone bare, the way they went every year, the way they would go again next year, whether I was here to see it or not. Margaret's bedroom upstairs was still the color of Lake Michigan on a clear morning. This house was not going to be sold. I thought about Elias with the box in his hands. Standing in my garage, this garage, the one I'd spent Wednesday morning cleaning out, finding the gap behind the shelf, pushing the box into the dark space, turning the dials to my badge number, closing the lid, walking away. He'd said run. He'd always known I wouldn't. Tomorrow I was going to write a letter. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. Not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what to say. The difficulty was in the tone. Too aggressive, and Hargrove would send a lawyer instead of coming himself. Too conciliatory, and he'd smell the arrangement behind the words. What I needed was the precise tone of a man who was tired and old, and had found something that frightened him and wanted to make it disappear quietly. The tone of someone offering a transaction rather than a confrontation. The tone of someone who could be managed. I wrote it by hand on plain paper. No return address, no letterhead. I said I had found materials belonging to a former colleague that appeared to relate to matters from 1996. I said I was not interested in legal proceedings or public attention. I said I was an old man who wanted to understand what had happened to his partner and then be left in peace for whatever years he had remaining. I said I believed we could reach a private understanding if we met in person, somewhere quiet, somewhere that held a particular meaning for both of us, given what we both knew about how that year had ended. I suggested the old Kellerman cold storage building on the western edge of Cicero, a warehouse that had stood empty for 20 years, the loading dock facing a dead-end service road that nobody used anymore. I knew the building from a scene I'd processed there in '91, a different case entirely. And I knew its layout in the way you know places that have marked you, not as a map you can recite, but as a physical sense of space and distance and the location of every door. I sealed the letter in a plain envelope and mailed it to Hargrove's campaign office on Michigan Avenue, not to his home address, which I also had. To the office, because a man like Thomas Hargrove handled private threats through his office, through the people paid to manage things before they reached him. The letter would be opened by staff. It would be assessed. And then it would be placed in front of him. Because the mention of 1996 and a former colleague's materials would make it exactly the kind of thing that couldn't be delegated downward. I gave it 2 days. On the second evening, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Chicago area code. The voice was male, middle-aged. The careful, neutral tone of a professional intermediary, someone paid to make contact, without leaving fingerprints on the contact. He said the senator was willing to meet. He suggested a different location, a campaign storage facility in Bridgeview. Neutral ground. Equipment and materials only. No staff on weekends. I said, "Tell the senator I appreciate the counter-proposal. Tell him I'd prefer the location I suggested. Tell him the reason I suggested that particular building will be clear when we meet, and that if he understands what I found in my garage last Wednesday, he'll understand why the location matters." There was a pause. The intermediary said he would relay the message. He called back 40 minutes later. He said Saturday, 9 o'clock. The Kellerman building. I said I'll be there. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a while. Then I called Kyle and told him the meeting was set. He said, "There's something else." "I found Sandra Reeves," I said. "Found her? How?" He said he'd reached out through a professional network, using a selective profile. Nothing false, just carefully framed. Presenting himself as a researcher, working on a retrospective piece about corruption investigations in the Chicago metropolitan area in the 1990s. He said her name had come up in a context suggesting she might have relevant background knowledge. I said, "And?" He said, "She called me within 2 hours. The first thing she said, before she asked anything about the research, before she asked who I was or who I worked for, was, 'Is this about Elias Drummond?'" I sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet around me. Outside the window, the October evening was doing what October evenings do in Chicago, settling into the dark with a cold that meant it. She had been waiting, too, all these years, in Scottsdale. With her careful anonymity and her small digital footprint, she had been waiting for someone to ask the question. Kyle gave me her number. I called her that night. Sandra Reeves sounded older than I remembered, which was reasonable, since we had both gotten considerably older, and also somehow exactly the same. The same directness, the same quality of arriving at the point without making the arrival feel rushed. She said, "I've been wondering when this call would come. I expected it sooner, honestly." I said I only found the box last Wednesday. She said, "I know about the box. I'm the one who moved it." I let that sit for a moment. She said, "Not recently. 2004, somewhere around there. I'd been back in Chicago for a conference, and I drove past your house on impulse. I don't know exactly why. Some things pull at you, even after you've spent years trying to leave them alone. I parked down the street and sat for a while, and then I drove around to the alley behind your garage." She paused. She said the box had been in a different location originally. Elias had told me about it, not the exact location, but that it existed, and that it was somewhere only you would eventually find it. When I came back in 2004, your neighbor on the west side had been doing significant construction work, and I was worried the original spot had been disturbed. So I moved it. Further back, behind the shelf, where it would be harder to find accidentally and easier to find for someone looking deliberately. I said, "You left the mud on the garage floor." She said, "I'm sorry about that. It was raining and I was in a hurry." I said, "How much did Elias tell you?" She said, "More than he should have, and less than I needed. He trusted me with the photographs, the basic structure of the land deal, the name at the center of it. He didn't give me everything because he was protecting me the same way he was protecting you, keeping the people he cared about at the edge of it rather than the center, so that if it came apart, the damage would stop at him." She was quiet for a moment. She said I was at that meeting, not inside, outside, running my own surveillance, separate from his, because I'd picked up a different thread that led to the same place. I didn't know Elias was inside until I developed my own photographs and saw his car in the background of one of the frames. By the time I understood that we'd both been working the same thing independently, The timeline was already moving faster than either of us could manage. I said, "After he died, you went quiet." She said I had a daughter who was 4 years old. I had seen what happened to Elias. I had the same information he had, and I had watched what it cost him. And I made a choice. And I have lived inside that choice every single day since November of 1996. The line was quiet. She said I moved the box because I couldn't do what needed to be done with it myself. But I couldn't let it disappear either. So I put it in the safest place I could reach, and I waited for you to find it. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I said I'm not calling to assign blame. Sandra, she said, I know. What do you need from me? I told her about Saturday and Kyle and the live stream. I told her about Garrett Pruitt and Diane Cho and the formal statement already being prepared. I told her what I needed from her was a written account, dates, details, everything she remembered about what she had seen and what Elias had told her, submitted to Diane Cho's office before Saturday, so that the federal record existed independently of whatever happened in the warehouse. She said I'll have it there by Friday morning. She said, Arthur, he won't come alone. He'll bring people. I said, I know. She said, he'll let you talk because he wants to know what you have and whether he needs to take additional steps after the meeting concludes. He won't move against you in the building if he believes the meeting is a transaction. The danger is in the afterward, I said. The meeting won't last long enough for afterward to become relevant. A pause. She understood what I meant. Then she said, tell Elias I'm sorry, if there's any way for that to reach him. I said I would. I hung up and sat in the kitchen with the quiet house around me and thought about all the people who had been carrying pieces of this for 30 years. May with her music box, and her Gregory the cat, and her sharp, dark eyes that still knew what they knew. Ricky Voss, with his ceramic shepherd, and his 30 years of careful silence at the flea market. Garrett Pruitt, with his altered form, and his animal clinic, and the firm handshake of a man finally setting something down. Sandra Reeves in Scottsdale, with her daughter and her small digital footprint, and the box she'd moved in the rain. All of them holding their peace, separately, not knowing if anyone else was still holding theirs, waiting for the moment when someone would pull it all together. Elias had put my badge number on the lock. He'd known, even then, who that someone would be. I went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time all week. I slept better than I had in years. Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of late October day that Chicago produces when it wants to remind you that what's coming is not a suggestion and not negotiable. I spent the morning in the garage, not looking for anything this time, just working, moving things with the clarity of intention that Wednesday's dutiful compliance with Danny's request had entirely lacked. I found the old set of woodworking chisels in the back of a drawer, still sharp, still wrapped in their original oiled cloth, bought at a hardware store on Madison Avenue that had been closed for 15 years. I set them on the workbench and looked at them for a while. Margaret had always said I would build things eventually. When the job finally let me go enough to use my hands for something that didn't involve taking things apart. The job had let me go now. Kyle arrived at 4 in the afternoon with his backpack and his laptop, in the particular focused stillness of someone who is prepared thoroughly and is now simply waiting for the moment to arrive. We went through the technical details at the kitchen table one final time. He walked me through exactly what would happen at the 3-tap signal, the stream opening, the feed routing through Hargrove's campaign infrastructure, the notification going to 87,000 followers and whatever press accounts were monitoring the feed. He had tested the route twice already with dummy content, Both times, it had worked exactly as designed. I asked him how long before the content would be indexed publicly. He said, 30 to 45 seconds after the stream opens. I thought about Elias's 8 months of patient, careful, off-the-books documentation. Building a case one piece at a time, in the dark, alone, for an audience he never got to reach. 87,000. Plus press. 30 to 45 seconds. I said, that'll do. I drove to Cicero alone, leaving at 8. I told Kyle to be in position outside the building by 8:15, and to stay in the car with the heat running until I signaled him. I told him under no circumstances to come inside the building, regardless of what he heard. He said, I know. I said, I mean it. Kyle, he said, I know. Grandpa, he hadn't called me that since he was about 12 years old. I didn't remark on it. I picked up my keys and my jacket and walked out to the Ford. The drive to Cicero took 25 minutes in light Saturday evening traffic. The Kellerman building sat at the end of a dead-end service road off a commercial strip that had been slowly losing its tenants for a decade. A few auto body shops with their lights on, a closed laundromat, a cell phone repair place with a single lamp burning in the back window. The warehouse itself was large and dark, its loading dock facing the service road. A pedestrian door on the east side secured with a padlock that was considerably newer than the building. Someone had been here to make arrangements. Someone had wanted the door openable. I cut the padlock with my bolt cutters and went inside. The interior was vast and cold and dark, with the particular textured darkness of large, empty spaces. The kind of dark that has weight to it, that registers against you as a physical presence rather than simply an absence of light. I stood just inside the door and let my eyes adjust, staying still the way you stay still in any unfamiliar dark space, listening before moving. The building smelled like cold concrete and old machinery, and the faint chemical ghost of industrial storage long since removed. I found the center of the main floor by memory and feel the floor plan from '91 still in me, the way old floor plans are. Not as something you can consciously recite, but as a physical sense of proportion and distance. I positioned myself with my back to nothing and a clear line of sight to the east door and both the high south windows. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and felt the Colt 45, Elias's gun. I'd loaded it that afternoon, not because I intended to fire it, but because an unloaded firearm in a meeting like this one was theater, and I was not there to perform. If something went wrong in ways I hadn't accounted for, I wanted the weight in my pocket to be real. I waited. At 9:02, headlights swept across the high south windows as vehicles turned onto the service road. 2 sets of lights, then a third. 3 of them came through the east door. Thomas Hargrove was in the center. He was 68 years old and looked exactly like his campaign materials. Tall, silver-haired, the posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his presence was expected and his authority was assumed. He wore a dark overcoat, no tie, the studied casualness of someone who had considered his appearance for this meeting and decided that casual communicated confidence. The 2 men flanking him were not introduced and required no introduction. They wore the particular blankness of professionals whose function is to be present and capable and invisible until circumstances require otherwise. Hargrove looked around the warehouse with the appraising efficiency of someone cataloging a space simultaneously for its usefulness and its risks. Then he looked at me, standing alone in the center of the floor, and something in his expression settled the settling of a man who has confirmed that the situation is what he expected it to be, and is therefore manageable. He said, "Callahan." I said, "Senator." He walked toward me with the unhurried confidence of a man who had not had a genuine reason to feel threatened in 30 years. He stopped about 10 feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the geometry of a transaction rather than a confrontation. He said, "You've had a busy week." I said, "It's been a full one." He looked at me for a moment. The practiced public smile was absent. This was not a public-facing situation, and he wasn't wasting it. What was present instead was a cold, appraising intelligence. The intelligence of a man who had survived 3 decades by correctly calculating what people wanted and what they feared, and the precise relationship between the two. He said, "You found Elias's box." I said I did. He said, "And now you want to know if what you think happened actually happened." I said I know what happened. I've known the shape of it for 30 years. What I needed was the details filled in. And I wanted to hear them from you. Not from a witness, not from a document. From you. In this building. Because I think you owe Elias Drummond that much to say it out loud in the place where it started. To the one person who has been waiting long enough to deserve to hear it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. I don't think Thomas Hargrove had experienced guilt in any functional sense for a very long time. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a man who understands that the moment he has been preparing for has arrived, and that the preparation was, in some fundamental way, not equal to the actual weight of it. He said, "You're not wearing a wire. My people checked the building before you arrive." I said, "No. I'm not wearing a wire." He looked at me for a long moment. 10 feet of cold warehouse air between us. The building settling around us in the silence. The distant sound of the city going about its Saturday evening, entirely indifferent to what was happening in this particular building, on this particular dead-end road. Then he talked. He talked for 11 minutes. He told me about the land deal, the structure of it, the Delaware shell companies, the layered corporate distance between himself and the mechanics of the pressure applied to families who had farmed that land since the 1940s. He told me about Elias, about how Caruso had fed him reports on the progress of the investigation, about the moment when the reports indicated that the chain of documentation had gotten close enough to constitute a real problem. He told me about the calculation he had made in the fall of '96. The particular arithmetic of a man weighing a career and a freedom against the life of a detective who had gotten too close to something too big. He told me about the Tuesday evening in November, the arrangements, the choreography of it, the cleanup. He told me about Garrett Pruitt and the visit to the medical examiner's office, and the specific conversation that had corrected the number on the form from 1114 to 930. He told me all of it with the flat, almost clinical precision of a man who has carried a thing for so long that the narrating of it no longer requires the emotional resources it once demanded. He told me because he was certain that what was said in this warehouse tonight would remain in this warehouse. That an old man with no badge, no recording device, no institutional backing, and no apparent mechanism for turning a conversation into consequence, had no real power over him, regardless of what he confessed. When he finished, he looked at me with something that was almost satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has said the hardest thing and survived the saying, and confirmed that the saying changes nothing. He said, "Now, what is it you actually want?" I reached into my jacket pocket. Not for the Colt. I left the Colt where it was. I took out my phone and held the screen toward him. The number on the screen was climbing. 143,000, 167,000, 189,000. His own campaign account's live stream viewer counter, visible in the corner of the frame that Kyle had been broadcasting from the parking lot outside for 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The feed routed through Thomas Hargrove's own campaign infrastructure, carrying Thomas Hargrove's own voice to every supporter and press monitor and curious Saturday evening citizen who had received a live notification from a state senator's account and clicked to see what their senator was announcing tonight. Hargrove looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. I said, "The gun isn't loaded. It never was tonight. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to understand that this ended the way it ended because of what Elias had, and what he left behind, and what enough people held on to long enough for the right moment to arrive. Not because of a firearm." I put the phone back in my pocket and put both hands at my sides. Outside, the first siren started. Not local police, federal vehicles. The distinctive, coordinated cadence of an FBI response arriving from two directions simultaneously. The sound of something that had been set in motion 2 hours earlier, when Diane Cho's office received the full package Garrett Pruitt's formal statement. Sandra Reeves's written account, submitted Friday morning as promised. The photographs from the film canister. The medical examiner's report with the discrepancy annotated in red, and the live stream link provided as contingency documentation. Nothing had required the contingency. Everything had worked exactly as it was supposed to work. Thomas Hargrove stood in the center of the Kellerman warehouse floor and listened to the sirens converge, and said nothing. His jaw was set. His posture was still excellent, even now. Even in this. The posture of decades didn't simply leave a man. The two professionals who had come with him looked at each other and made the calculation that men in their position make when a situation has moved definitively beyond the scope of their engagement. They didn't run. They simply went very still and waited for instructions from a world that was no longer listening to Thomas Hargrove. The east door opened. 4 agents in jackets that announced their affiliation clearly. A fifth I recognized as Patterson, one of Diane Cho's associates. A young man with the brisk, competent manner of someone doing precisely what he had been trained to do, and finding the doing of it satisfying. Patterson looked at Hargrove. He looked at me. He said, "Mr. Callahan, thank you for your cooperation this evening." I said, "Thank you for being on time." They walked Thomas Hargrove out through the east door of the Kellerman building in Cicero and into the cold, clear October night. And I stood in the center of the warehouse floor and listened to the sound of vehicles outside, and the building settling around me in the cold, and the silence that followed the sirens, which was a different kind of silence than the silence that had preceded them. I took Elias's watch out of my jacket pocket. I held it in my palm for a moment. The cracked crystal, the frozen hands, the time that had told the truth when the official record had chosen not to. 11:14. The number that had waited 30 years in the base of a music box to be seen by the right person at the right moment. I turned it over once. I felt the weight of it, which was not heavy, but which had always felt heavier than its actual weight. Then I crouched down and placed it carefully on the concrete floor of the Kellerman building, in the center of the space where it had all finally concluded. I didn't need to carry it anymore. It had done what it was made to do. I stood up. I walked out through the east door into the night air, which was cold and clean, and tasted like the particular freshness that comes after something long overdue has finally been resolved. Kyle was standing beside the Ford. He wasn't supposed to be outside the car. I had told him specifically to stay inside. I looked at him, and he looked back at me with the steady, unapologetic expression of someone who has made a decision they consider reasonable and is prepared to discuss it calmly if required. I decided not to require it. We stood beside the car in the cold for a moment without speaking. The federal vehicles were still on the service road, their lights moving in the darkness. Somewhere in the city a train was running, the distant sound of it moving through the night the way it always had, indifferent and continuous. I said, "Close the stream." Kyle took out his phone and closed it. We got in the Ford and drove home. Danny was at the house when we got back. He was sitting at the kitchen table, with his coat still on, and a cup of coffee he'd made himself, which was notable. And he looked up when we came in through the back door, and looked at each of us in turn, and then looked back at his cup. He didn't ask what had happened. He'd been watching the stream on his phone. I found that out later. Found out that he'd been sitting at that table for the better part of an hour, watching his father's voice come through his senator's own campaign account to an audience that had reached 240,000 before Kyle closed the feed. He'd watched all of it, and he hadn't called, and he hadn't come to the building, which was exactly what I would have asked him to do if I'd thought to ask. I took off my jacket and hung it on the hook by the back door, the hook that had been there for 26 years. The hook that Margaret had put up herself one Saturday afternoon with a drill she'd borrowed from the neighbor and returned the same day because she believed in returning things promptly. I sat down at the table. Kyle sat down too. Nobody said anything for a while, which was fine. Some moments don't need language applied to them immediately. Some moments are better served by simply sitting inside them and letting them be what they are. Danny said, "Are you all right?" I said yes. He said, "Is it done?" I said yes. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. Then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Not the managed, carefully calibrated expression of a son dealing with a difficult father, but something simpler and older than that. The expression of a man looking at his father and seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time. Or perhaps for the first time in long enough that it amounted to the same thing. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. We sat at the kitchen table together, the three of us. 3 generations of Callahan men in a kitchen with Margaret's tiles on the floor, and her rose bushes outside the window going bare for the winter. And Kyle got up at some point and found the bourbon and 3 glasses. And he poured without being asked, which was the right thing to do. And we sat with our glasses in the quiet of a house that was not going to be sold and did not need to be. Outside, the October night settled fully into itself. The city went about its business. The rose bushes moved slightly in the wind. I thought about Elias. Not about the box, or the watch, or the letter, or the photographs. I had thought about those things enough for 30 years, to last several lifetimes. I thought about him the way you think about someone when you no longer need to carry the weight of what happened to them. When you can simply remember who they were. The fishing trip in '87. The way he laughed when something genuinely delighted him. The 11 years of partnership that had given me more than the job took away. On balance, though the balance had taken a long time to feel true. I thought about what he'd done hiding that box, putting my badge number on the lock, writing 2 sentences on a piece of paper and folding it twice and leaving it for me to find when the time came. The patience of it, the trust of it, the particular kind of faith that says, I can't finish this, but I know who can, and I'm going to make sure they have what they need. He'd said run. He'd always known. I picked up my glass and held it for a moment. Then I said, quietly, not to Danny or Kyle, but to whoever or whatever was present in that kitchen beyond the 3 of us, to the particular quality of presence that a life leaves behind in the places and the people it touched. The work is done. Elias. Go ahead and rest now. In the weeks that followed, a great deal happened that I will not describe in detail, because it belongs to lawyers and courtrooms and news cycles, and the long, grinding machinery of accountability, which moves slowly, but which, when it finally moves, is difficult to stop. Thomas Hargrove was charged on multiple counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact in the death of Elias Raymond Drummond. The charges were federal, which meant they moved through a different channel than the one he had spent 30 years carefully maintaining. Vincent Caruso, who had been living quietly in Rockford for nearly 3 decades, was located and charged separately. Garrett Pruitt's cooperation with Diane Cho's office was noted in the official record in a way that acknowledged what it had cost him and what it was worth. The farming families whose land had been taken never got their land back. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly. The part that reminded me that justice and restoration are related, but not the same thing, and that the gap between them is where a great deal of ordinary human suffering lives, without anyone famous being responsible for putting it there. I thought about that gap for a long time. I still think about it. I kept the house. Danny stopped mentioning the realtor. He came by more often, which I hadn't expected, and which I found that I wanted, which was also something I hadn't entirely expected. He brought Carol once, in November, and the 4 of us, Danny and Carol and Kyle and I, ate dinner at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening. And it was the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening, but that you know, even in the middle of it, you will remember. Kyle finished the semester with grades that his father described as exceptional, and that Kyle described as fine, which was the same information delivered through 2 different filters. He came by every Saturday morning, the same as always, and made coffee and sat at the table, and occasionally said something so precise that it stopped me where I stood. I cleaned out the garage properly in November, which took 3 full days, and produced 11 garbage bags and 4 boxes for donation, and 1 workbench cleared completely of everything that had accumulated on it over 26 years. I bought a new set of woodworking tools, not extravagant, just solid, the kind of tools that do what they're supposed to do without requiring you to think about them. I built a small shelf first, because shelves are honest things, functional, straightforward, exactly what they appear to be. I hung Elias's photograph on the wall of the garage. Not the group photo from the precinct picnic, a different one I'd found in a box while cleaning. A candid shot from somewhere in '89 or '90. The 2 of us standing outside a diner on the west side after a long shift. Both of us looking at something outside the frame. Both of us looking like men who are tired and present and exactly where they're supposed to be. I looked at it for a while on the day I hung it. Then I went back to work on the shelf. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. It means more than I can easily say. If it moved you in some way, if it felt true, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you think about the things we owe the people we've loved, please consider sharing it with someone who might feel the same. A like or a subscription helps this kind of storytelling find the people it's meant for. God bless you, and take good care of the people in your life while you have them.